Okay, so we're going to get into a little more detail on the traits. One thing I want you to notice here is this curvature in the snow pea that we have. The cupping, this is very typical of these types, and it figures into our story in a little bit. So peas have been around for quite a while, as we mentioned at the very beginning, but our the historic information on the edible potted peas is not as extensive. We do find things, for example, like this painting by Torkowski from about 1795 that shows snow peas in a still life here. Again, notice the cupping of the pods and the uh, the, the lack of straightness in these types. So peas, the edible potted peas were most likely derived through stepwise mutations in existing field peas and garden peas. Um, Basically, people would find mutations that eliminated fiber in the pod and would preserve these types, and then that would become a snow pea. Dwarf gray sugar, for example, you may be familiar with that variety. That's one that comes from a field pea background, whereas something like mammoth melting sugar probably comes out of a garden pea background. Snap peas arose also from snow peas with a second mutation that would change the pod wall thickness from thin, as you see here in this picture for the snow pea, to thick with the snap pea. Most of the modern day snap peas have white flowers and wrinkled green cotyledons, which suggests that they have garden pea origins. And many of the most recent ones have been actively bred um, and coming, interesting traits from things that were not snow peas or snap peas. But in the past, this is the kind of the stepwise pattern that these types have come about. There is historical evidence for snap peas being around quite some time ago. I've found reference in an herbal by John Ray from 1686 to sickle peas, which which are probably snap peas. He talks about the pods being edible and they are very easily destroyed by birds and things like this. Vilmorin in his vegetable garden described what he called butter peas, which based on the pictures were snap peas in the description and pictures. Wellensink, a pea researcher in 1925, was working with what he called the great butter pea, which appears to have been a snap pea. Hedrick in 1928 in the classic uh, uh, Vegetables of New York in the pea book described a butter sugar group where he knew of 6 varieties that fit this group, and these were described as being edible potted, succulent, thick-walled, and that sort of thing. So they've been around, but they've always been just kind of a minor vegetable. And so why is this? Why haven't they been more popular in the past? A lot of this can be, I think, attributed to their popularity today can be contributed to the work of Calvin Lamborn, who was a pea breeder at Galveston Seed Company for many years. The first variety he developed was Sugar Snap and was released about 1979. What he was trying to do, he was given the problem of solving that pod distortion that I pointed out earlier in the snow peas. And he thought, well, what would happen if he crossed this rogue type that was found in a garden pea dark skin perfection, which was thick-walled. It was the N gene. And what if he crossed that to a snow pea, and he crossed it to mammoth melting sugar? And he discovered that yes, it does straighten out the pod, but you get something totally new and different. And so this was the origin of the snap pea. And at that time, he wasn't aware of these types that had been people had worked with before. But he jumped into very enthusiastically promoting these types and pretty much single-handedly increased the popularity of these types got them going. Most varieties that you grow today are going to be ones that came out of his program or have been derived from his material. Um, there are a few that are not. For example, at Oregon State University, we have a variety called Cascadia, which uh, comes out of our program. But for the most part, the the snap peas out there are all from Calvin Lamborn's program. Okay, some of the traits that are specific to snap pea. Here is pod fiber, or the called parchment. You can see in the picture here the high fiber pods tend to be very smooth, and as they dry down, then they maintain their shape, whereas low fiber pods tend to become wrinkled and distorted. This middle pod is a snow pea, and this bottom pod is a snap pea, and you can see that there are differences in the shape that are specific to snap pea here. There are two genes that control the expression of pod fiber. When they're present in the dominant form, you get fiber entirely present. If you're recessive at the V locus, you get little patches of fiber distributed throughout the pod. If you're recessive at the P locus, you get fiber primarily along the dorsal and ventral sutures. There's a separate gene that controls the fiber in the strings or the pod sutures that we'll come to in just a moment. But when you put P and V together, then you pretty much have absence of fiber in the pod wall. Pod wall thickness is another gene that makes the snap pea unique. This is controlled by the N gene. It's again a recessive gene expressed in with the thick pod walls. It has pleiotropic effects of reducing overall pod size. It tends to give pods a round cross section, and they tend to be more curved than with the dominant N. Basically, what's happening is there's an increase in the number of parenchyma cells, and there's also some increase in cell size as well. Another gene that is important, you can have snap peas that are stringy or snap peas that are stringless. What I mean by that is that they have a string, they have or don't have a string in the pod suture. This is a stringy type here where the pod strings has partially been pulled, and then here's a stringless type where we did the same thing with it. Stringless this is controlled by the SYN2 gene, or synphili, which means without strings in Latin. It's a temperature-dependent gene where under warmer conditions it's more strongly expressed, things are more stringless, and under cool temperatures you'll tend to see a string present in the pod. It also affects other plant parts as well. Pods and plants will be somewhat shorter, smaller. It becomes more pronounced under heat and in stressful environments. So stringless types can be, if you try to grow them in particularly warm conditions, will be very non-productive. And in fact, the seeds planted into warm soils will sometimes not fail to come up just because they're of their weakness that is enhanced by the warm conditions. The stringlessness is controlled by a single recessive gene, and it shows distorted segregation ratios. You get way fewer stringless types than expected if you make a cross and you look at the F2 generation. And what causes this is that the SYN2 gene also reduces pollen tube growth rates, so that the pollen is less competitive than normal pollen, and which causes the distortion in inheritance. Another effect of the SYN2 gene is that when you combine it with the wrinkled trait, seeds are dimpled rather than being wrinkled. And this is confusing sometimes when you're making selections out in the field. So now on to snap pea breeding.